why has it been any different than important factors on which employers might distribute this kind of
Mhm.
why is genetic information any different?
Well, for that, in that respect, it isn't. But genetic information, as was said earlier, I mean, genetic information is not only information about you. It's also immutable. It's not information that can change over time, the way, for example, a smoker could join a smoking cessation program. But more importantly, even genetic information is a very different type of medical information because it's not just about you. It's about your family. It's about subsequent generations. So it's information about your entire lineage. And in that respect, we're talking about information that encapsulates potentially a lot of people into the future.
I'm wondering if there's any effort to expand the coverage of GINA, and a couple of areas that are obvious that are very closely connected to health insurance. One could be life insurance,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that GINA covers 650,000 registrations. It's only covers health insurance, but not life insurance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, obviously, health insurance is used to pay for doctors, so I don't think there's any effort to have doctors also protected from disease.
Well, I would say that, I mean, in the reason why, I can tell you exactly what the reason why GINA covers health insurance and employment, and the reason why is because that is what was politically feasible. I mean, that's the reason it covers those two. I mean, it's clear that those were the two areas where we had the most concern, and that there was the most evidence that that problems were already occurring. But even early on, we were aware that there could be potential issues in other forms of insurance, particularly, but in other areas of life as well. Anywhere where predictive capability might have some value to the actor. But those were the two areas, and it was actually, and GINA took 15 years to pass. It was very difficult just to get employment, which was not initially part of some of the earlier drafts of GINA. It was difficult just to get employment coverage. So it was a political calculation, not a substantive calculation, to cover those two. Moving forward, my hope is that we can continue to sort of build, as I said, build upon the foundation of GINA. I can say that Congress is certainly far more educated about these issues now than it was when we started, and I think will continue to be more educated as they deal with other issues related to biotechnology. But it's oftentimes difficult to get Congress's attention after something like GINA for some time. So our hope is to slowly build the momentum to do something new. My expectation, though, is that at least in the near term, most of the post-GINA legislative action is going to be at the state level. As I mentioned, there's a bill that was recently introduced in Massachusetts. There was a bill that was introduced a couple years ago in California that would have regulated genetic information as it related to the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry. And I think we're going to start to see more of those attempts in the future. I certainly hope Congress will pay attention, but I don't expect anything from Congress in the near term.
Are there potential benefits to those areas to make it an action if consumers are thinking about this, talking about this, giving employers information could employees want to offer genetic information in the future showing that they're more likely to have more organized or things that are strengths that
Well, that's hard to answer. Most of the there's been a lot of what I like to call sort of gene myths studies out there trying to find associations between genetics and a whole host of different attributes. There was a case that was just dismissed in New York because the judge had claimed there was a pornography gene, and was trying to and was using that as part of in a criminal trial. The truth is that there are a lot of these types of claims out there, and a lot of studies have come along trying to make those types of claims. Outside of the health context, there is very little that we know about gene associations and personality traits, for example. So I don't suspect that we'll see anything for some time that'll really, elucidate that more. But I think in terms of when an employee would want to share information, well, I mean, to the degree that they're willing and understand, what protections are in place. I mean, there may be areas with employer wellness programs where the employer has a relatively sophisticated wellness program, and the employee wants to take advantage of an offering by divulging genetic information. I personally don't know that those types of situations are all that valuable to the employee, but the employee might decide that it's valuable. The intent of GINA is to make sure that they're fully informed and that their decision is voluntary, but in the end, it's the employee's decision.
So even forgetting personality traits, what about showing a clean bill of health? I have no genetic abnormalities. I don't have the
Mhm.
Brett gene. I don't have Huntington's. I don't have any of those genetic abnormalities. Are they allowed to?
Well, we all have
Is
genetic.
an
I mean,
employer
there
allowed
is no perfect human being.
Sure.
So-
But these
so-
are things that employers
so-
look out for.
Well, that could. I mean, look, we are learning every day about new gene associations. The problem is that it's relatively the first thing that you do, and frankly, the easier part is making some sort of association. What that actually means clinically, we still know very little in most cases. So I don't know that would have much value at all to an employer, with perhaps certain exceptions. There are some very rare genetic single gene association conditions where Huntington's comes to mind, where if you have the gene, it's highly likely that you will develop the condition. I guess, but I mean, how many employees are going to go up to their employer and say, I don't have Huntington's? Well, I mean, most people don't anyway. So I'm not sure that how often that would happen. Frankly, if I were an employer and if I were counseling an employer, I'd say I don't want to know. If I were corporate counsel, the first thing I'd tell an employer is, if an employee wanted to divulge genetic information out of very defined circumstances, you don't want to know that information, and that is hopefully what corporate counsel are advising their employers to the degree that they are. Well, one of the main areas that GINA changes, for example, has to do with conditional offer of employment under the ADA. Under the ADA, when you make a conditional offer of employment, you can ask for certain types of health information. GINA doesn't allow, even at that stage, an employer to collect genetic information. That's a change from what might have been employer practice prior to GINA. So that's an area. I think, in terms of systematic problems, I suspect probably some of the more systematic problems that employers will have probably have to do with either wellness programs or frankly with the more sort of the way they deal with employees. An employer who asks an employee how they're doing, they're protected by GINA if the employee divulges information. An employee who starts to get into a more in-depth conversation, starts asking what might be considered probing questions, that's not protected by GINA, and the regulations make that clear. So in the way employers interact with employees, I think employers need to be a lot more careful about engaging in conversations that might produce genetic information in terms of the conversation. I think Perhaps some of the ways employers conduct background checking might be implicated to the degree that many employers are now going to the internet and just, in a rather, frankly, unsophisticated and way, and in a way that is really not particularly well structured. They're just Googling people and looking on Facebook, and I mean that's sort of the way a lot of employers, particularly smaller HR departments, go about that process. I think they're going to need to be a little bit more careful about what they're plugging in and what they're looking for to make sure that they don't run afoul of some of the privacy provisions of GINA as well.
So I don't know, Jeremy, if the EEOC regs address this, but it seems to me that one of the potential areas of concern was people applying for leave under the Family Leave Act, the federal,
Right,
and
FMLA,
that you have to document some need for it to and sort of how much is enough to validate the leave and how much is crossing over.
Right. I mean, FMLA is still an exception, remains an exception under the collection of genetic information. But the regs make it, they don't go particularly far in giving us a lot of background, but I mean, they do make it clear that genetic information is only required when it is absolutely necessary, and the overreaching, any type of overreaching would not be protected under the GINA exception. So employers, when they're conducting FMLA compliance issues, do have to be careful to make sure that that they aren't asking for genetic information unless they absolutely have to in order to verify the claim.
I think we're out of time.